Coming up, Virginia has decided. Voters have said yes to redrawing Virginia's congressional districts. And just hours later, the courts say not so fast.
Rural Virginia is angry.
I would be shocked. I think it would be a terrible mistake for any court, whether it's a state court or a federal court, to overrule the voters, essentially.
Voters are split, politicians are at odds, and by the way, have you seen the new map? Have you truly looked at it? At what point does this stop being classified as redistricting and morph into blatant gerrymandering?
If you can't rein in your politicians, this is what we're going to get with great frequency.
This week, we watched something remarkable play out. We saw a high-stakes vote in Virginia with national consequences taking precedent over local impact. A slim majority of voters have approved entirely redrawing Virginia's congressional map, and the change is dramatic. A potential shift from, quite frankly, a fairly balanced map with 6 Democrats and 5 Republicans to potentially as many as 10 of the state's 11 districts leaning blue. Every district dramatically redrawn, every race this November completely changed. So we're hearing this question come up again. Is this fair representation, or is this just the next chapter in America's gerrymandering war? We're breaking down who wins, who loses, and really what it means for control of Congress. Thank you for joining us on this special edition of WUSA 9+. I'm Simone D'Alba. Let's begin with the current state of play. Barely 24 hours after passing, a judge in rural Virginia intervened, effectively putting everything on pause. He ordered the results of the election not be certified on several grounds. The judge argues that state lawmakers didn't follow their own rules when they passed the redistricting referendum. In fact, the judge wrote the referendum was void ab initio. It's Latin for from the beginning, calling the ballot language, quote, flagrantly misleading. And we heard Republicans echoing that sentiment throughout the election.
The Democrat Party is ruthless. And what they did, you know, they wrote a ballot initiative that was completely disingenuous. This is not saving democracy. If you look at the actual vote totals by county, which I did this morning, it proves that the 6-to-5 ratio is accurate. This is a sham.
So whether you call this a sham or whether you agree with it, one thing nobody is arguing is that this is normal, right? Because it isn't. If there were rules to this political game, they're gone now. The counter argument from Democrats is that you fight fire with fire, and they say this is their only chance at fighting back against Donald Trump.
Last night was a big victory for the people of Virginia, a big victory for America, and a big victory for democracy. Donald Trump and Republicans launched this gerrymandering war, and we've made clear as Democrats that we're going to finish it. We will not let Donald Trump rig the midterm elections by gerrymandering maps all across the country without a forceful Democratic response. That is what you saw in Virginia. That is what you will see in Florida. And that is what has taken place all across the country.
But something to consider. Does fighting fire with fire burn the whole house down? You and I get to find out together. In the meantime, what's always worth watching is what the President of the United States pays direct attention to. So here's his social media post about Virginia. He says the election was rigged, calling it a crooked victory. In a post on Truth Social, Trump alleged irregularities in the vote, pointing to mail-in ballots and what he described as suspicious timing of the results. The referendum itself passed narrowly, about 51 to 48%. Was there any reported fraud? No. As of right now, there is no public evidence of widespread fraud tied to the referendum. And the money involved tells you just how high the stakes really are. As of last week, campaigns on both sides had raised a combined $89 million for a state referendum on a Tuesday in April. Look, I always appreciate perspective in moments like these, so I went to someone who studies these moments for a living. Dr. Larry Sabato with the Center for Politics at UVA joined me to talk about really how consequential this special election truly was. Let's start with this. So less than 24 hours after voters approved the redistricting referendum, a judge has now blocked it. I wanted to get your take on that right out the gate.
Sure. That's the same judge that tried to stop it twice before it happened. He is a circuit judge a Republican. He's running for office as a Republican from Tazewell County. It's a big county in Southwest Virginia that voted, are you ready for this? 88% against the referendum. So he's reflecting popular view in his area. This was totally expected. Both sides knew there would be a legal challenge or challenges after the referendum if yes won. And of course, yes did win, 51-49, 52-48, something like that. So this is going to go on for a while, and the primaries are not until early August. So the candidates have time to file and get their campaigns organized and decide what district they're running in, if in fact the Supreme Court, state Supreme Court, doesn't rule this off the ballot.
I wanted to ask you, if this new map holds, we could see things shift from that competitive balance of the 6-5 to something like a 10-1 split. When the voters approved this, I wanted to get your take on that, your thoughts on it.
Well, first of all, we don't know for sure that it will end up being 10-1 because voters are ornery creatures and they often don't do what map makers tell them to do or think they're going to do with the lines that they draw. So I think there'll be some surprising competitive races that we're not thinking of at the moment. But beyond that, this turned very partisan. It wasn't completely partisan. This wasn't like a candidate election. For example, I know a substantial number of Democrats who voted no because they kept saying two wrongs don't make a right, two wrongs don't make a right. Whereas most Democrats voted yes. The vast majority of Republicans voted no. And you can see the division just looking at the map. There was hardly a rural county in Virginia from the Atlantic Ocean to the tip of Lee County at the end of Virginia that didn't vote against this referendum, whereas it was carried by overwhelming margins in Northern Virginia, in Richmond, and in Hampton Roads. So that's a very stark division of the state. It was generated by this whole effort across the country, not just in Virginia. And it's regrettable. It was started by Donald Trump in Texas, and he clearly didn't think this through. We didn't realize that it would end up including Democratic states like California and Virginia.
Well, look, you said, when we're speaking about the maps directly, when you saw those new districts, many of them have changed drastically, right? I mean, I was reading once that if your district resembles an animal, you have been gerrymandered, right? Or something to that effect. And now Republicans in Virginia are saying they've been shut out. Do you think they have a legitimate argument here?
Well, we have a lobster, the 7th district, which includes parts of Northern Virginia, and it really does look like a lobster. I can see it instantly. Of course, this is gerrymandered. What kind of gerrymander, of course, is reflected in your party identification, whether you like it or dislike it. I would love it if, first of all, the states, maybe through an interstate compact, would agree not to redistrict in mid-decade, to do it only once a decade. It's difficult enough once a decade. It's divisive enough once a decade. And you can have other ways of banning gerrymandering if you really want to. Well, they really don't want to. So I doubt we're going to see any of this in the near future, at least.
When you heard Democrats say, essentially part of their argument in this was they're going to concede power in some way in 2030, 2031, when this can be, up for discussion once again. I mean, when you hear something like that after they've redistricted the maps, I mean, do you think, what do you make of all that? I wasn't sure what to do with it.
Here's the way it's going to work. It will revert to the system that was passed by the voters in 2020, a quote nonpartisan redistricting system, except it didn't work. It collapsed and it went to the state Supreme Court. The state Supreme Court drew the current lines. They're the ones who came up with the 6-5. I bet you $1 to your dime right now, it will be the very same thing in 2031. It'll end up going to the state Supreme Court because the politicians, the Republicans and the Democrats in the General Assembly, will not be able to agree. And so we'll have court designated districts once again. So that's my suggestion to you of what's going to happen. But at least we'll have new numbers. We'll have fresh numbers coming out of the Census Bureau, and they'll have to make some changes. But you can gerrymander anything. And gerrymanders, you could have kindergartners drawing the lines with crayons, and it would probably turn out to be a gerrymander of one sort or another.
I'm curious, as you look forward, where do you think this all ends up? How you think we're just going to be in legal entanglements for quite some time with this?
The lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, I'm delighted to tell you that, but the lawyers I've talked to who know something about redistricting tell me that this could either be shut down quickly by the Virginia Supreme Court, or it could go on, which is dangerous because we're going to get to the point where candidates are not going to be able to organize their campaigns or maybe even file. They may have to delay the primaries further. That would be either by court order or by the General Assembly. We've had primaries as late as September, so I suppose it could go that late. But voting starts in late September. We have mail voting beginning in late September. So this is going to be a very constricted election season unless it breaks fast. And that's going to be up to the Virginia Supreme Court.
If you had to leave us with one more thought with our audience, this was a lot to absorb, right? Over the past couple of days, the redistricting, it passing, and then legally getting the brakes put on. What would you leave us with today?
I would suggest this. If you can't rein in your politicians, this is what we're going to get with great frequency, not just once a decade, but twice a decade. And then it's only a matter of time before they start doing it every couple of years when party control changes in one or both houses of a state legislature. So it's time to say no to this kind of event. And let's remember, it was started by Donald Trump. Donald Trump started this whole thing, and it's been a disaster. It's been chaos all across the country. I don't think we need this additional divisive element in our politics.
Again, that was Dr. Larry Sabato. Now, the new Virginia map, right, it's not completely set. In fact, the Supreme Court of Virginia could still revert to the old map if it finds that Virginia Democrats did not follow what they call proper procedure in presenting the constitutional amendment to voters. The court will be hearing arguments beginning on Monday, the 27th. Well, among the lawmakers seeing a drastic change to their district is Congressman James Walkinshaw. So he represents Virginia's 11th district and is now facing a dramatically reshaped political landscape. Here's our conversation. So we're essentially going from the 6-5 Democratic advantage to a potential 10-1 split. And, we saw with the numbers as they came down, this wasn't decided by an overwhelming margin, right? So does this result justify such a dramatic shift in representation? It's a narrow number that we were seeing with the voters come down.
Well, we have to start with what's taken place across the country with Donald Trump commanding Republican-controlled legislatures in Texas, North Carolina, Missouri, now Florida to redraw their maps. And none of those states gave voters a voice. And in Virginia yesterday, we gave voters a voice and a choice. And the map that you have on the screen there was put before the voters, right? Everybody knew it wasn't a secret. They had the opportunity to look at it and review it, share their thoughts about it. And ultimately, yesterday, they decided to approve it and asked us to move forward with it. So I think, Virginia voters made their voice heard last night in Virginia. It's a closely divided state. Look, obviously, Abigail Spanberger won overwhelmingly in November, but that was kind of an outlier election. So winning in Virginia by 3, 4, 5 points is a comfortable win.
I wanted to ask, though, we were just looking at the maps, and if you're a Republican voter in Virginia, maybe you're more of a moderate voter and you live in a rural area. I mean, is this map fair from that lens?
Well, look, I represent the 11th congressional district right now in Fairfax County, and I represent hundreds of thousands of Republican voters today, right? Even though my district is overwhelmingly Democratic, I still represent hundreds of thousands of Republican voters, and that's true in every congressional district in Virginia and in the country. Every district has Republicans, Democrats, independents, and it's up to those folks who represent those districts to do their best to represent everybody and listen to everybody.
So we were talking about your district. You just mentioned it. It includes, again, major changes under this new map. For example, voters in Rockingham County who were once in the 6th district, which is quite red, deep red, are now paired with parts of Fairfax County. And you spoke to this a bit, how you engage voters and represent those communities. But, this election, we were talking to voters and it really came with some heated emotion. There was a lot of concern over it being called redistricting instead of just blatant gerrymandering. And so where do you go from here in terms of connecting with those deep red voters?
Well, look, I think one, with respect to redistricting or gerrymandering, I support, and every Democrat in Congress supports, a national ban on partisan gerrymandering. To Republicans, including my Virginia Republican colleagues who have refused to support, sometimes even voted against that national ban on gerrymandering, that's the way to move forward. Both parties agree we're going to ban it nationally, then we don't have to fight it out state by state. With respect to rural communities in Virginia, look, rural voters, rural communities have been hit hard by Trump administration policies. We got 9 rural hospitals in Virginia at risk of closing. Farmers struggling with fertilizer costs that are up 30-40% because of Trump's war in Iran. So I'm going to be having that conversation with voters across the new 11th district between now and November, and I know a lot of folks across Virginia will as well.
Well, help me reckon with what you just said, because you support a national ban on gerrymandering, and was this not just blatant gerrymandering?
Well, you can't have a situation where Democratic-controlled states do nonpartisan redistricting and Republican-controlled states gerrymander. And we have tried for decades to get Republicans to join us in opposing partisan gerrymandering. Our Republican-controlled neighbors in North Carolina, as Virginia Democrats were moving forward with the nonpartisan process, were gerrymandering Democrats there into the Atlantic Ocean. I've come to the conclusion that the only way we're going to convince Republicans, including my Republican colleagues here in Virginia, to join us in supporting a national nonpartisan, a national ban on partisan gerrymandering, is for them to learn and understand that Democrats are going to fight them every step of the way. And at best for them, gerrymandering will be a wash. They're not going to gain an advantage through gerrymandering anymore. Hopefully that will convince them to join us, sign on to our legislation to ban gerrymandering nationally.
Let's talk about where this goes. Do you think, in terms of what's coming down with courts, with legal challenges, any insight you would offer there?
Yeah, look, I'm not an attorney. Having reviewed it, they don't seem to have a lot of merit. The opposition that has been raised in the lawsuits, the Virginia Supreme Court will make a determination. I'll just say it would be a shocking thing, and the court made a decision to allow the referendum, the vote yesterday, to move forward without making a ruling. It would be pretty shocking, unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented, for a court to overrule a decision that voters just made. They would essentially be taking the voters' voice away from them. I'd be shocked if the Virginia Supreme Court did that, but we'll learn soon enough.
All right, Congressman James Walkinshaw, thank you so much for the conversation and for joining me this morning. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I also spoke to Virginia Congressman Don Beyer about how the new map could impact District 8. We'll have that conversation coming up next. Another lawmaker facing a dramatic shift in his district is Congressman Don Beyer, who represents Virginia's 8th district. Once anchored in Northern Virginia, his district is now set to stretch south, reaching all the way toward Hampton Road. I wanted to start with this because your district stretches from Arlington to Yorktown, which is different, right? Much broader, very different than before, and you're up for re-election. How do you earn trust with your voters across a map that has been so dramatically redrawn?
Well, the good news is I used to spend a lot of time there when I was lieutenant governor, but I'm really looking forward to it. It's a different constituency, and they care a lot more about farming and fishing. And the trips I've made there in the last couple of weeks, they're really concerned about poor internet service. They're worried about the rural hospital closing. I think what I have to do there is the same that every good political leader does everywhere, which is spend a lot of time with them and listen very carefully.
Okay, a question, because we're going from this 6-5 Democratic advantage to a potential 10-1 split, right? This was not decided by an overwhelming margin. Does a result this narrow justify, the dramatic shift in representation? How would you explain that more to people who don't understand or feel disenfranchised?
Well, I think one of the most important things is we did let the people decide. Unlike Texas and North Carolina and Ohio and Missouri, where they're doing it all just through the legislature, we actually did a referendum. We put it on the ballot. The two parties spent a lot of money trying to educate people about it. And I do think, by the way, it looks like it could be 10-1, but it doesn't have to be. We still have to earn it. We have to go out to those new voters and point out that we did this only because of what Donald Trump did in Texas and other places when he said he deserved these other citizens. Yeah, I still very much cherish the Virginia constitutional amendment that has no gerrymandering, but this is a response to Republicans and Trump trying to rig the 2026 elections. And happily, it's temporary.
You said something interesting. You used the word gerrymandering. I was going to say something we've seen from voters as we're communicating with them. They're saying this is blatant gerrymandering. Why are we calling it redistricting still? And can you speak to that? Do you have an opinion?
Well, first, I'm proud of what Virginia did in the constitutional amendment. But when we look at Trump picking up 5 seats in Texas, 3 in North Carolina, 2 in Ohio, 1 in Missouri, and they're about to do 6 in Florida. They're tilting the national map very much towards gerrymandered districts. So the whole notion was that we always want to be the good guys, but you can't just get punched in the face and then not fight back. Trump has been so hard on Virginia, especially the people that we represent in Northern Virginia, which has taken the biggest hit because of DOGE and all the cutbacks of all the people that are out of work. And so it's no accident that we got 80% turnout or 80% yes votes in Arlington and Alexandria and 70% in Fairfax.
Okay, quickly, Republicans are calling this the most gerrymandered map in the country. Your response to that?
Now, if you look at the map, there's still a lot of places that Republicans can win if they turn out to actually represent the people. And, we're not deserving of this. We have to go fight for it. And we'll be doing that every day.
All right. Virginia Congressman Don Beyer, certainly appreciate your time in the conversation this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Welcome back. A good rule of thumb, if you're wondering whether your state has been gerrymandered, just take a look at the map. One political analyst I spoke with said if the district starts looking like misshapen animals, there's a good chance you should start asking questions. I spoke to Josh Rottenberg, the author of Draw the Line in Ohio, about what just happened in Virginia and why you should care.
People say that baseball is America's favorite pastime, but really it's gerrymandering, and for all the wrong reasons. A lot of people think that it began in 1812 with former Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry approving a district map that had weird shapes. One of them was drawn like a salamander, and instead they called it a gerrymander, even though it's pronounced gerrymander today. But the origins of this process really date back to even the 1730s, before we were even declared independence in 1776. But now everything's being perfected through software, and lawmakers are drawing these districts down to the street to make sure that they pick their voters instead of the other way around.
I wanted to ask you about this. Let's focus on Virginia, because if this new map holds, it really is a big shift, and it shifts this competitive balance to something like a 10-to-1 split. When the news came down about Virginia, with your expertise on gerrymandering, I'm just curious. I know it's going to stall with the courts, but for now, what did you make of it when the news came down that it had passed?
Yeah, 2 different things. I mean, first off, this is the most ironic form of direct democracy, because you had voters that were asked the question of, do you want politicians to have more power in shaping these districts than yourselves? And the majority of Virginians said yes, just like in California. This was sold to them as fairness, but the question is fairness to whom? Because I can guarantee you there were a lot of Republican voters that went to bed on Tuesday night and woke up on Wednesday morning wondering where their representation is going to go because of the numbers that you just outlined that theoretically could come to place in Virginia. And so the question is right now is what is obviously going to happen, but let's reframe the conversation from how many seats one party will control versus the other, and now how many voters will have their rights suppressed as a result of what's likely coming down the pike with gerrymandering.
And you've been talking about this, you kind of touched on it a moment ago, but some of the Republicans in Virginia, look, they're completely disenfranchised at this point. They're saying they're being shut out entirely. Do they have a legitimate argument?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, when lawmakers choose their voters instead of voters choosing their lawmakers, this process is just going completely off the rails. And really, it's incumbent upon voters to understand that they are the ones that have the power. The politicians work for us. And so ultimately, when lines are drawn fairly, then what wins the day is just policy positions. And that really should be what our politics and our governing is all about. If one party or one candidate can say to the voters, here are my policy positions, and there are fair districts that are drawn, then ultimately the quote unquote right person will win. But when you have gerrymandered districts, then the cake is baked in primary elections and general elections no longer matter.
So we've seen this play out, right, across the country. Your book details this. Texas, Ohio, Virginia, with possibly Florida up next on the docket. Is this now just the political standard strategy on both sides?
It doesn't have to be. Again, this is a choice for voters, not just in Virginia, but around the country. What we're still waiting to see ultimately is what happens at the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court is going to decide what happens with the Voting Rights Act. And if that falls, you're going to see potentially a lot more gerrymandering happening in the South, in Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina. But voters right now have a choice. Again, you need to become more politically engaged. You can't just tune in and tune out when there's a special election like this, or if there's a presidential election every 4 years. If they want to truly take the power back away from these politicians, then they can. It's just a matter of, is this going to happen? And are these parties ultimately going to continue to fight one another? Because we're seeing right now, it's just a race to the bottom.
So to understand what's happening in Virginia today, you have to go back. We're talking way back. The word gerrymander, as you heard just a bit in that interview, is more than 200 years old. The Library of Congress traces it to March 26th of 1812, when the Boston Gazette used it for the first time after Massachusetts redrew its Senate districts. The governor at the time was Elbridge Gerry. His party had redrawn the map to their advantage. In fact, he signed off on it, but what made it stick wasn't the politics of it all. It was the shape. One of the newly drawn districts looked so contorted that people said it actually resembled a salamander. So take a look at this. An artist named Elkanah Tisdale drew this as a mythical creature, part salamander, part dragon, and then published it as a political cartoon. So that's really how this all comes together. Gerry, salamander, gerrymander. You see the path here. His party had redrawn the map to their advantage. And here's the part that I found most interesting. Gerry found the whole thing exceedingly disagreeable. In fact, he argued against it. He almost sent it back, but he signed it anyway, and it cost him. The gerrymander worked so well for his party that the Federalists actually won a majority of the popular vote and only a third of the seats. But Gerry himself lost his re-election bid. His name became a bit of a punchline and a warning. The man who hated the map, who signed the map, lost because of the map and still got blamed for it for the next 200 years or so, right? That was 1812. Today, Virginia is still fighting the same fight. Different party, different map, but make no mistake, it is the same game. Now, gerrymandering, right, is not unique to the United States, but how it's handled here really stands out compared to other democracies. In many countries, politicians play a much smaller role in drawing maps. So instead, we see independent commissions take over, with rules intended to make the process much more neutral. In fact, in the United Kingdom, for example, boundary commissions handle redistricting, operating independently from elected officials. And in places like France and Australia, there are multiple layers of review, really designed to limit how much maps can favor one party. The bottom line here is, while the U.S. largely leaves redistricting up to the states, many other democracies have added safeguards to reduce political influence in the whole process. Basically, the opposite of what we experience here in the United States. All right, so back to what happened in Virginia. Where does this all go next? Well, there are several lawsuits challenging this referendum. We've got the judge in rural Virginia who blocked the election certification, and the state Supreme Court considering whether this all is legal. Those arguments begin on Monday. On a national scale, the back and forth over congressional districts is expected to continue in Florida, where the Republican-led legislature is scheduled to meet April 28th for a special session there that really could result in a more favorable map for Republicans. So think of what just happened in Virginia, but with the advantage flipped. I'll leave you with this. Whether you're happy about what happened in Virginia or you're opposed to it, whoever draws the map shapes who gets heard. And in this political climate, that reaches far beyond one state. Thank you so much for joining me on this special episode of WUSA 9+. I'm Simone D'Alba. You can catch me weekday mornings on WUSA 9 from 4:30 a.m. to 10 a.m.